Let's begin learning the muscles that move the humerus. So when you move the humerus, that movement is occurring at the shoulder joint, right? So if the shoulder joint does 6 things, we need to learn the muscles that perform those 6 actions. I'll remind you what those 6 motions at the shoulder joint are. They are flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, and then rotation. And you can rotate medially towards the body or rotate laterally away from the body. So we typically divide these muscles into 2 groups. You've got the rotator cuff muscles, and then you've got the non-rotator cuff muscles. Now, they're all going to move the humerus, so they're all going to insert somewhere on the humerus. If you remember, a couple of the major insertion points are the tubercles. So recall the tubercles are those knobs that are at that proximal end. We also have the deltoid tuberosity, where your deltoid muscle inserts. So all these muscles insert into the humerus. They perform some type of action, one of those 6, or in some cases the muscle might perform more than one of the actions. And then you also have the rotator cuffs, which have an additional function, which is to help stabilize the shoulder or glenohumeral joint. So we're going to learn the 4 rotator cuffs first, and then we'll move on and learn the non-rotator cuff muscles, which that just means they don't help to stabilize the shoulder joint. So the first one is known as the subscapularis. This one is not shown on this view because this is a posterior view. How do we know it's a posterior view other than the fact that it says? Remember, the spine of the scapula is in the back. This would be the spine. This is the acromion. This you can see is the vertebral border of the scapula because it faces the vertebral column. So this is posterior. If we were to look at the other side, the anterior view, we would find the subscapularis muscle. And the subscapularis muscle performs medial rotation of the humerus. How does it do this? It inserts into the lesser tubercle, which is on the other side of the humerus, and it pulls that lesser tubercle towards the midline, and that'll rotate that humerus inward. So it's medial rotation. Next, we're going to learn the supraspinatus. So again, if this is the spine and this is above the spine, that's how it got its name, supraspinatus. It originates in this fossa here, and it inserts into the greater tubercle and pulls on that greater tubercle. And if you pull on that greater tubercle of the humerus, that humerus will move away from the midline. So the supraspinatus performs abduction of the humerus. Below the spine, we have the infraspinatus and the teres minor. Both of these rotator cuff muscles perform the same action. They insert on the greater tubercle, and if you pull on that greater tubercle this way, this humerus will rotate laterally. So this arrow is trying to show you lateral rotation. So we're turning the humerus away, all right, which was opposite of the subscapularis. So notice, if you're in the front of the scapula, you medially rotate it. If you're in the back of the scapula, you laterally rotate it. And the supraspinatus is kind of on the top of the scapula. And when it pulls on the humerus, it abducts the humerus. All right, so these are your 4 rotator cuff muscles. They're rotator cuff because their tendons surround and form basically like a cuff around the joint and help stabilize. And then they have these specific actions on the humerus. Okay, so now let's look at the non-rotator cuffs. And we're going to use this view as well as the posterior view. So this is kind of a full body drawing. we see that there's a deltoid muscle here in the shoulder. So here and here are the deltoids. The deltoid muscle actually can perform 3 different actions. So it can do 3 of the 6 actions. It's best known for abduction. So notice that that is the motion that the deltoid is kind of known for, and that's because it's the prime mover for abduction. So it provides the greatest force when you abduct your humerus at the shoulder joint. It also helps to flex, though, and extend the humerus. And it all depends on what compartment of the deltoid gets stimulated. This is more of the anterior compartment. So when this part of the deltoid gets stimulated, it causes flexion of the arm. If more this part, kind of the lateral part, gets stimulated, it performs the abduction. And then if the back of the deltoid, the posterior compartment, gets stimulated, it causes extension. So it's one muscle, but depending on what part of the muscle gets stimulated the most, it can perform 3 different actions. Second one, pectoralis major. All right, this muscle actually is the prime mover for 2 motions. Adduction, so moving that humerus back towards the midline. Flexion, and that again is decreasing the angle at the shoulder joint. And then it can also help to medially rotate the humerus. So again, it's one muscle, but it can actually perform 3 different actions. This picture I just want to point out shows another view of the sternocleidomastoid. Kind of like the view here because you can see that it actually comes off the sternum here and the clavicle there, and that it inserts into the mastoid process. We also see that serratus anterior, again, just another view of that muscle. If we turn this around and look at the posterior, back, we see the trapezius. Again, remember that's the muscle that moves your scapula. So remember, keep that muscle separate because it's moving the scapula, not the humerus. And we can see when you have this muscle back here contract, it can either elevate the scapula if you're kind of stimulating more of this portion, or it can retract the scapula if you're stimulating more of this portion of the muscle. And here you can clearly see the 4-sided trapezoid shape of the trapezius. This shows the back of the deltoid, so this would be more of the posterior compartment back here, and the posterior compartment does the extension of the humerus. Teres minor, that's a rotator cuff, so we did that previously, but you can see it on this drawing as well. And then there's the latissimus dorsi. So latissimus means wide. So it's a very wide muscle, and then dorsi means your back. So it's a very wide muscle in the back. All right. Now, if you follow that muscle, notice where it's going. It's kind of crossing that shoulder joint and inserting into the humerus. So even though it's a lower back muscle, it's moving your humerus. It's the prime mover for extension of the humerus, but it can also help to adduct. So in this case, it'll kind of work together with your pectoralis major. And then it does lateral rotation as well. So I want you to think about these muscles and how they can often be synergist with each other, or they can be antagonists of each other. So if you think about a specific action, so let's think of adduction. So adduction is going to be moving that humerus towards the midline. The latissimus dorsi does it, as well as the pectoralis major. So if the motion is adduction, those muscles are synergistic. All right, they do the same thing. Now, if you think of extension, they are antagonistic because the latissimus dorsi does the extension. If I jump backwards, the pectoralis major flexes. So in that case, they are opposite one another. They are antagonistic. If we look at the deltoid and the abduction that it causes, that would be antagonistic of the pectoralis major because it does adduction. All right? So when muscles do more than one thing, they can be synergistic. They could also be antagonistic of another muscle. All right? So it all depends on what is the action first. And then does it do the same thing or does it do opposite? All right. There's another muscle called teres major. You might have thought, well, if there's a teres minor, there must be a major. It's not a rotator cuff muscle. All right. The minor is. The teres major is not. It doesn't help to stabilize. Basically, it's just another muscle that does extension, adduction, and lateral rotation. So if you know what the latissimus dorsi does, the teres major does pretty much the same thing. It's just nowhere near the size of the latissimus dorsi. All right, let's move on. So now we're moving into the brachium. All right. And if you're a muscle inside the brachium, you're probably acting at the elbow. All right. So even though these muscles are in the arm, they're not necessarily moving the arm, they're moving the forearm at the elbow joint. So this is an anterior view of the brachium. A good rule of thumb is if you're in the anterior brachium, you flex the elbow. All right? And we're going to learn two major elbow flexors. First one we've heard of, the biceps brachii. So biceps meaning two origins. So notice we've got one origin here and it's tendon. We have another origin here and it's tendon. It's brachii because it's in the brachium. So that's how it got its name. And then it inserts, if you remember, at the radial tuberosity of the radius. So when it pulls on that radial tuberosity, it causes flexion of the forearm at the elbow joint. So it flexes your elbow. All right? Prime mover for elbow flexion. There's a synergist called the brachialis, and that one's named very similarly in that it's in the brachium. The major difference is, one, it's not the prime mover, so it's just not as strong as the biceps brachii, and it inserts into the other bone. It inserts into the ulna at what's known as the ulnar tuberosity. All right? So they're both flexors of the elbow, so they're synergistic. Biceps is the prime mover and inserts at the radius. Brachialis is synergistic and it inserts at the ulna. Okay, so now you've got a really strong flexion at the elbow joint. If we look laterally, so this is a side view of the brachium, we can still locate the biceps, that's right here, and the brachialis. But we can also see that in the back of the brachium, the posterior compartment is your triceps brachii. So it actually has three origins, and it inserts at the olecranon of the ulna. So when this muscle contracts, it performs extension of the forearm at the elbow joint. So it's the prime mover, and this makes the triceps antagonistic or opposite acting compared to the biceps and the brachialis. There's a synergist of the tricep. It's called the anconeus. Anconeus actually means elbow because it's found kind of at the elbow area. It's much smaller than your triceps, but it is synergistic. So it also extends the forearm at the elbow joint. This is just another drawing This was that same kind of full body drawing. There's the biceps. You see a little bit of the brachialis here and here. The best view of the brachialis is right here. Notice it's in the anterior compartment with the biceps, but it's kind of nestled in between the biceps and the triceps. Here's the posterior view. There's the triceps. There's the little anconeus. So these are the elbow extensors. All right, if we move down into the forearm, it can be a little scary there. There's a lot of muscles in your forearm. And the reason we have a lot of muscles in the forearm is because we want precision to our hand and figure movements. The more muscles you have, the more precise the movement is. We're not going to learn them all, but we're going to learn some of the major ones. So this is an anterior forearm, and the similar rule applies. If you're in the front, you're probably a flexor. And then if we turn it around and we look at the posterior, you're probably an extensor. Unless you're the pronator. So this guy here pronates. So remember what pronation is. When you pronate, you move that radius over top of the ulna and you turn those palms over, right? Pronation, palms down or palms posterior. Notice you can see how that muscle will work. It's grabbing that radius and pulling it over top of the ulna to cause pronation. All right? This muscle here is known as the flexor carpi radialis because it flexes the wrist and it runs more along the radius, all right, than the ulna. Now notice this muscle actually can do two things. It'll flex the wrist. That's how it got its name. All right, so that's basically what I'm showing with this arrow. All right, you flex that wrist. But since it's a radialis muscle, so it's more on the lateral side of the forearm, it can actually move this hand this way, and that is abduction of the hand. So the flexor carpi radialis flexes the wrist and abducts the wrist or hand. All right. Next one we have is called the palmaris longus. This one is named because it's a pretty long muscle and it inserts right into the middle of the palm and it flexes the hand or wrist. And because it's right down the middle, that's pretty much the only thing it does. But if you're on this side, you're going to be a flexor carpi ulnaris, and you can work with the other two and flex. Or you can just pull on this side here and you can adduct. All right, so notice these three arrows are all my flexing movements. But then you can abduct and adduct. All right. If we tear these out, take these out and look underneath them, we can see a flexor digitorum superficialis. So notice that name means you flex fingers. Superficialis means it's a more superficial muscle. There's actually a deeper one underneath it called the profundus. But again, this one flexes fingers. So it's got tendons that go into multiple fingers, pull on those fingers, and it flexes them. So when you clench your fists, right, when you make a fist, you're flexing your fingers. There's a muscle here called the brachioradialis. It's actually a pretty big muscle. It's the largest muscle in your forearm. It's named based on the fact that it's in your brachium and it runs along the radius. And it does a number of different things: flexion, supination, and pronation. So those are muscles of the anterior forearm. If we turn this forearm around, this is the back of it. All right, this is posterior. And in the back of your forearm, posterior, you're going to have extensors of the wrist and fingers. You have an extensor carpi ulnaris. All right, so remember the ulna is the pinky side. So that's the extensor carpi ulnaris. It's going to extend the wrist. That's how it got its name. It also adducts. So it can move this hand away towards the midline, adduct. All right, the body is here. All right, so this movement would be towards the body, therefore adduction. We've got an extensor digitorum. So again, if we had a flexor digitorum, we probably have an extensor. So that's when you straighten your fingers out. You extend them. And then on this side, the radius side, you've got extensor carpi radialis. And there happens to be two of them. One's longer than the other, so it's called the longus. So this is going to extend the wrist. That's how it got its name. But perform abduction as well. Okay? So notice the two radialis muscles. Both the flexor and extensor both abduct. The two ulnaris muscles, the flexor and extensor, adduct. Okay, that's probably a good stopping point. We're going to move down into the thigh and leg, and that'll be our last video.